At my championship game, my uncle stormed the field and screamed, "He's been using steroids!" The referee had just blown the final whistle on our state championship victory when my Uncle Gary burst through the security barrier and sprinted across the field, his face red and his finger pointed directly at me like a weapon. The stadium had been erupting with noise from the 12,000 fans who'd watched us win 28-24, but his voice cut through everything when he grabbed the field microphone from the sideline reporter who was about to interview me. "My nephew is a cheater. He's been injecting steroids for 2 years and the whole season is a fraud." I stood there in my muddy uniform with my helmet in my hand, my teammates frozen around me, the celebration dying in real time as every camera in the stadium swung toward Gary's face. The ESPN broadcast was live, which meant millions of people across the country had just heard my uncle accuse me of being a drug cheat in the most public moment of my 17-year athletic career. I'd been playing football since I was 8 years old, working my way up from Pop Warner leagues through middle school and into high school, where I became the starting linebacker for Lincoln High School in our junior year. My parents, both high school teachers, had always supported my athletic ambitions while making sure I maintained a 3.8 GPA and stayed grounded about the reality that very few high school athletes ever play professionally. My Uncle Gary was my father's older brother, a former college football player himself who'd blown out his knee senior year and lost his chance at the NFL. He'd been involved in my training since I was young, running drills with me in the backyard, critiquing my film, pushing me to be better and faster and stronger. I trusted him completely because he was family and because he genuinely seemed to care about my success, celebrating my achievements and consoling me after losses with equal investment. The championship game had been the culmination of an undefeated season where our team dominated every opponent, and I'd been named the Defensive Player of the Year for our conference with 143 tackles, 12 sacks, and 5 forced fumbles. College scouts from 23 Division I programs had contacted me, and I'd narrowed my choices to scholarship offers from Michigan, Ohio State, and USC. The game today had been my final performance for the scouts in attendance, and I'd played the best game of my life with 18 tackles, 2 sacks, and the game-sealing interception with 90 seconds left. I was supposed to be celebrating with my teammates and talking to reporters about our victory. Instead, I was standing in the middle of the field while my uncle destroyed everything I'd built. The stadium security guards reached Gary and tried to pull him away from the microphone, but he was a big man, 6 feet 3 inches and 240 pounds of former athlete who knew how to use his weight. He shook them off and kept talking, his voice amplified across the entire stadium and the broadcast. "I have proof. I have photos of the needles and the vials. I have testimony from people who've seen him inject. This whole season is built on performance-enhancing drugs, and everyone needs to know the truth." My coach, Dennis Carver, who'd been with the program for 19 years and won 4 state championships, rushed over and finally got between Gary and the cameras. He took the microphone and tried to restore some order, announcing that there would be an official statement later and that everyone should clear the field. But the damage was done, and I could see it on the faces of the scouts who'd been watching from the sidelines, their expressions shifting from impressed to skeptical to disgusted. My father appeared beside me, his hand on my shoulder, his face white with shock and anger. "What is your brother doing? He's lost his mind." My mother was crying in the stands, my younger sister holding her hand while both of them stared at Gary being escorted out by 4 security guards. The team athletic trainer, Monica Reeves, came over and quietly suggested we get off the field immediately before the media swarmed. She led me and my parents through the tunnel to the locker room where my teammates were gathered, most of them silent and confused, some whispering among themselves. Our team captain, Jordan Ellis, came over and said what I was thinking. "Dude, what the hell was that about? You don't use steroids. We all know you don't use steroids." I thanked him and tried to explain that I had no idea why Gary would say something like that, but my voice came out hollow because I was still processing the humiliation of being accused in front of everyone. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. Coach Carver entered the locker room and closed the door, addressing the team with the kind of serious tone he used when someone got injured badly. "Gentlemen, what just happened out there is going to be investigated thoroughly. Kyle has been a model student-athlete for 4 years, and I have complete confidence in his integrity. But the accusation was made publicly, and we have to follow protocol. Kyle will be tested immediately and will cooperate fully with the State Athletic Association. Until this is resolved, we need to support our teammate and not engage with any media speculation." He looked at me directly. "Kyle, you'll need to give a urine sample tonight and blood work tomorrow morning. The Athletic Association will handle it according to standard procedures. Is there anything you want to tell me privately before we proceed?" I shook my head and told him honestly that I'd never used any performance-enhancing drugs of any kind, that I didn't even take supplements beyond basic protein powder and vitamins. The drug test happened an hour later in a medical facility at the stadium, administered by Dr. Lawrence Kingsley, the official physician for the State Athletic Association with 22 years of experience in sports medicine. He explained the process while preparing the collection materials, informing me that the sample would be sent to a WADA-certified laboratory in Salt Lake City for comprehensive analysis, including tests for anabolic steroids, human growth hormone, stimulants, and masking agents. The chain of custody would be documented at every step to ensure the results would be legally defensible if this escalated further. Dr. Kingsley was professional and neutral, treating me like any other athlete being tested rather than someone already assumed guilty. I provided the urine sample under direct observation according to protocol, watched him seal and label the container, and signed all the documentation confirming the process had been followed correctly. My parents took me home around midnight after the testing was complete, and we drove in silence because none of us knew what to say about what Gary had done. My phone had 187 text messages and 43 missed calls, mostly from teammates and friends asking if I was okay, but also from reporters requesting comments and strangers sending accusations or support. My father kept trying to call Gary, but got no answer, and my mother kept saying she couldn't believe her brother-in-law would do something so cruel and reckless. When we got home, I went straight to my room and sat on my bed staring at the wall, trying to understand why someone who'd been such a big part of my athletic development would suddenly try to destroy everything. The only explanation I could imagine was that Gary had some kind of mental break, or believed something that wasn't true, but even that didn't make sense, because he'd been at practice with me just 3 days ago, and everything had seemed normal. The story was everywhere by morning, trending on social media with the hashtag steroid scandal, and speculation running wild about whether I was guilty or innocent. ESPN ran a segment discussing the accusation with sports analysts debating whether my performance statistics suggested drug use, showing clips from the championship game alongside comparisons to known steroid cases. Some commentators defended me, pointing out that I'd been tested randomly throughout the season as required by the Athletic Association and had always been clean. Others suggested that sophisticated athletes could beat the tests and that Gary's accusation should be taken seriously since family members would have inside knowledge. The most frustrating part was that none of them knew anything concrete. They were just filling airtime with speculation while my reputation got destroyed in real time. The blood test happened Monday morning at 7 o'clock at Dr. Kingsley's private practice, with even more comprehensive panels that would detect substances the urine test might miss. He drew 5 vials of blood and explained that results from both tests would be available within 10 days, possibly sooner if the lab prioritized the case given the public attention. Dr. Kingsley asked me directly if there was any substance I'd taken, even unknowingly through supplements or food, that might show up on the tests. I told him truthfully that I'd been careful about everything I consumed, that I bought protein powder from reputable brands, and avoided any supplements that weren't certified by third-party testing organizations. He noted my answers in his file and said he'd be in touch as soon as results came back. The Athletic Association placed me on administrative suspension Monday afternoon, effective immediately until the investigation was complete. The director of the association, Thomas Blackwell, who'd overseen high school athletics in our state for 16 years, called my father to explain that this was standard protocol for any performance-enhancing drug accusation and didn't imply guilt. However, the suspension meant I couldn't participate in any team activities, couldn't attend practice, couldn't wear team gear, and couldn't accept my scholarship offers until cleared. Mr. Blackwell emphasized that they were treating this seriously but fairly, and that if the tests came back clean, I would be fully exonerated and reinstated immediately. The phone call was professional, but the implications were devastating because college signing day was in 3 weeks, and we'd need to address the reputational damage and potentially pursue defamation claims against Gary for making false accusations that harmed my career prospects. She asked pointed questions about Gary's mental state, his financial situation, and whether he had any motive to sabotage me. I couldn't think of any reason beyond general family dysfunction or jealousy, but Catherine suggested we investigate further because people don't usually make public accusations this serious without some underlying motivation. The college programs that had offered me scholarships started pulling back almost immediately, not officially rescinding offers, but definitely cooling their enthusiasm. The recruiting coordinator from Michigan called my father Wednesday to say they were putting my recruitment on hold pending the investigation results, and similar calls came from Ohio State and USC over the next 2 days. These programs invested millions in their football teams and couldn't risk the negative publicity of signing an athlete under investigation for steroid use, even if the accusations might be false. Coach Carver tried to advocate for me, calling the recruiters to vouch for my character and explaining that the accusation came from a family member with unclear motives, but the damage was done and the schools were protecting themselves. Gary finally surfaced 4 days after the championship game, not to apologize but to double down on his accusations in an interview with a local sports blogger named Preston Hughes, who ran a controversial website known for inflammatory content. The interview was posted as a podcast with a transcript, and Gary claimed he'd been trying to protect me by pushing me to train harder, but eventually realized I was using illegal substances when he saw suspicious vials in my gym bag during a training session 6 months earlier. He described the vials in detail, saying they contained clear liquid with pharmaceutical labels that looked like testosterone cypionate. He claimed he'd confronted me about it, and I'd admitted using steroids, but begged him not to tell anyone. According to Gary's story, he'd wrestled with the decision for months before deciding that he had a moral obligation to expose the truth rather than be complicit in fraud. Every word of his story was a lie, and I had Catherine draft an immediate response statement. The allegations are completely false and will be proven false when the drug test results are released. I have never used performance-enhancing drugs and never confessed to using them. My uncle's claims about finding vials in my gym bag and having conversations about steroid use never happened. We are pursuing all legal options against him for defamation and will hold him accountable for the damage he's attempting to cause to my reputation and my future. Catherine posted the statement on my behalf and sent it to media outlets, but Gary's interview had already been shared thousands of times, and the narrative was taking hold that maybe there was something to his accusations. The worst part was not knowing why Gary was doing this, because his motivation didn't make sense from any angle I could see. If he genuinely believed I was using steroids, why wait until the championship game to expose it? Why not talk to my parents privately or go to the athletic association quietly? The public spectacle suggested he wanted maximum damage, but I couldn't understand what he gained from destroying my career. My father tried multiple times to reach him for an explanation, leaving voicemails and text messages that went unanswered. Gary's wife, my Aunt Linda, finally called my mother and said she was as confused as we were, that Gary had been acting strange for the past month, but wouldn't explain what was bothering him. The drug test results came back 9 days after the championship game, delivered to Dr. Kingsley, who called an official meeting with me, my parents, Catherine Grant, and Thomas Blackwell from the Athletic Association. We gathered in the conference room at Dr. Kingsley's practice on a Friday afternoon, everyone tense and nervous despite my confidence that the tests would be clean. Dr. Kingsley opened a sealed envelope from the laboratory and reviewed the results before reading them aloud. Both the urine and blood samples tested negative for all banned substances including anabolic steroids, peptide hormones, growth factors, beta-2 agonists, hormone antagonists, diuretics, stimulants, and masking agents. Kyle Thornton's samples show no evidence of performance-enhancing drug use. The tests were comprehensive and conducted according to WADA standards with proper chain of custody. These results are definitive. The relief I felt was overwhelming, my hands shaking as I gripped the edge of the table. But the relief was mixed with anger, because 9 days of suspension and public speculation had already done significant damage. Thomas Blackwell immediately lifted my suspension and issued a public statement exonerating me completely, stating that the Athletic Association had found no evidence of wrongdoing and considered the matter closed. Catherine drafted a more aggressive statement for my social media, announcing that I'd been completely cleared and that we were pursuing legal action against Gary for his false accusations. The college programs that had backed away started calling again, but the momentum had shifted, and some of them had already committed their scholarship slots to other linebackers. My father finally got Gary on the phone that evening and put him on speaker so Catherine and I could hear the conversation. The audio recording would potentially be useful for the defamation lawsuit. My father's voice was controlled but furious. Gary, the drug tests came back completely clean. Kyle never used steroids. You destroyed his reputation and damaged his college prospects over accusations that were proven false. What the hell were you thinking? There was a long pause before Gary responded, his voice sounding defensive and unrepentant. The tests must be wrong or he found a way to beat them. I know what I saw in his gym bag. Your son is lying and manipulating everyone. My father's composure finally broke. You didn't see anything in his gym bag because there was nothing to see. You made up a story and told it to the world. Why? What do you gain from trying to destroy your nephew's future? Gary's answer was bizarre and rambling, suggesting that I'd become arrogant and needed to be humbled, that athletic success was making me forget my family and my roots, that he was trying to teach me a lesson about integrity. None of it made coherent sense, and Catherine jumped in, identifying herself as my attorney and informing Gary that his statements were being recorded and would be used in legal proceedings. Gary immediately hung up, and my father threw his phone across the room in frustration. Something was seriously wrong with Gary's mental state, or there was information we didn't have yet, because his explanation didn't match his actions. Catherine filed a defamation lawsuit against Gary 2 days later, seeking $2 million in damages for harm to my reputation, loss of endorsement opportunities, emotional distress, and the impact on my college recruitment. The lawsuit included the video evidence of Gary's accusations at the championship game, transcripts of his podcast interview, and documentation of the scholarship offers that had been withdrawn or reduced following his statements. We also filed for a restraining order preventing Gary from making any further public statements about me or attempting to contact me directly. The case was assigned to Judge Martin Sheffield, a circuit court judge with 18 years on the bench who'd handled several high-profile civil cases. The restraining order hearing happened the following week, with Gary appearing without an attorney, representing himself and looking disheveled in a way that worried me more than angered me. Something was clearly wrong with him beyond just making poor decisions. Judge Sheffield reviewed the evidence and granted the temporary restraining order, prohibiting Gary from contacting me or making any public statements about me for 90 days pending a full hearing. The judge also ordered Gary to undergo a mental health evaluation to determine if there were underlying issues affecting his judgment. Gary tried to argue that he was being silenced for telling the truth, but Judge Sheffield cut him off sharply. noting that the drug test results had proven his accusations false and that continued defamation would result in contempt charges. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. My focus shifted to salvaging my college recruitment, with Coach Carver and Catherine working together to contact programs and rebuild bridges. Michigan and Ohio State had filled their linebacker spots with other recruits, but USC was still interested, and several other programs emerged as possibilities, including Florida State, Georgia, and Notre Dame. I scheduled official visits to all three schools, trying to present myself as the same athlete they'd been recruiting before Gary's accusations. The visits went well, but I could sense the residual doubt in some coaches' questions, the careful way they asked about my training methods and supplement use, making sure I understood their programs had zero tolerance for violations. The truth about why Gary made his accusations emerged 3 weeks after the championship game from an unexpected source. A private investigator Catherine had hired to examine Gary's background discovered that he'd been contacted 2 months before the championship game by a man named Vincent. Wait, that's a forbidden name. The investigator discovered Gary had been contacted by a man named Russell Pemberton, who claimed to be a sports agent interested in representing me when I went to college. Russell had approached Gary as my uncle and primary trainer, offering him $50,000 up front and a percentage of my future earnings if Gary could convince me to sign with his agency. When Gary refused and told Russell to contact me directly through proper channels, Russell had apparently become hostile and threatened to damage my reputation if Gary didn't cooperate. The investigator, a former FBI agent named Dorothy Chang, had traced Russell's phone records and email communications, uncovering a pattern of harassment toward Gary over the following weeks. Russell had sent Gary doctored photos that appeared to show me with steroids, along with threats that these photos would be released to the media unless Gary helped facilitate a representation agreement. The photos were sophisticated forgeries, created by superimposing my face onto images of other athletes in compromising situations. Gary, who wasn't technologically sophisticated, had apparently believed the photos were real and panicked, thinking I was actually using steroids and that the evidence would come out eventually. Rather than talking to my parents or me directly, he'd convinced himself that exposing me publicly was somehow protecting the family from worse scandal later. Dorothy presented her findings in a detailed report with supporting documentation, including phone records, email printouts, and metadata analysis of the forged photos. Catherine immediately filed an amended lawsuit adding Russell Pemberton as a defendant for fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit defamation. We also turned all the evidence over to the local district attorney's office, where prosecutor Angela Daniels reviewed the materials and determined there was sufficient evidence to pursue criminal charges against Russell for attempted extortion and fraud. The case was assigned to Detective Marcus. Forbidden name. The case was assigned to Detective Frank Delgado with the Financial Crimes Unit, who had 14 years of experience investigating fraud and extortion schemes. Detective Delgado moved quickly, obtaining warrants for Russell's phone records, email accounts, and financial records. The investigation revealed that Russell Pemberton wasn't actually a licensed sports agent, but rather a con artist who'd been running similar schemes targeting high school athletes across multiple states. He would approach family members of talented players, offer money for representation agreements, and when refused, would threaten or execute smear campaigns to damage the athletes' reputations. In at least 3 other cases, he'd successfully extorted money from families who paid him to prevent the release of fabricated evidence. The detective found Russell had a previous conviction for wire fraud and had been operating under multiple aliases. Russell was arrested at his apartment in Phoenix 4 weeks after the championship game, charged with extortion, fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The arrest made national news because it connected to my case and the viral video of Gary's accusations. Detective Delgado held a press conference explaining how Russell had manipulated Gary into making false accusations as part of an extortion scheme, providing evidence that cleared Gary of acting with malicious intent, while still holding him accountable for the damage his accusations caused. The detective's statement was important because it shifted the narrative from me being a suspected steroid user to me being the victim of a sophisticated fraud scheme. Gary reached out through his attorney 3 days after Russell's arrest, requesting a meeting to apologize and explain his side of the story. My parents and Catherine advised against it, but I agreed to meet him because I needed to understand how someone who'd been such a positive influence in my life could have been manipulated so completely. We met at Catherine's office with her present as my legal counsel and Gary's court-appointed attorney, a public defender named Stephen Brooks, who'd been assigned when Gary couldn't afford private representation. Gary looked like he'd aged 10 years in the 5 weeks since the championship game, his face gaunt and his eyes hollow. He started crying before he even began speaking, apologizing repeatedly for what he'd done, and explaining how Russell had manipulated him over the course of 2 months. Russell had shown him the doctored photos and claimed to have additional evidence, including video of me injecting steroids. When Gary refused to believe it, Russell had sent anonymous packages to Gary's house containing syringes and vials labeled with pharmaceutical names, claiming these were items I'd discarded. Gary had convinced himself the evidence was real and that I was heading toward a scandal that would destroy not just my career, but our entire family's reputation. In his mind, exposing me at the championship game was forcing the issue into the open where it could be dealt with rather than letting it fester and explode later with worse consequences. I listened to his explanation and understood intellectually how someone could be manipulated by a skilled con artist, but emotionally, I was still angry about the damage he'd caused. My championship celebration had been destroyed, my reputation had been questioned by millions of people, and my college recruitment had been severely disrupted. 3 scholarship offers had been permanently withdrawn, and I'd lost endorsement opportunities with sporting goods companies that had been interested in name, image, and likeness deals. The financial impact alone was estimated by Catherine to exceed $800. 000 over 4 years of college, not counting the emotional distress and reputational harm. Gary's apology felt sincere but insufficient, given the magnitude of what he'd done. Catherine intervened and explained that our lawsuit against him would proceed, but that she would recommend reducing the damages sought given the new evidence about Russell's manipulation. She proposed that Gary make a public statement taking full responsibility for the false accusations, apologizing to me and my family, and explaining how he'd been deceived by Russell Pemberton. She also required him to participate in a recorded deposition where he would detail Russell's entire scheme for use in the criminal prosecution. Gary agreed to all the terms and signed a settlement agreement that afternoon, acknowledging his liability and committing to the public apology. Gary's public statement was released 2 days later through Catherine's office, distributed to all media outlets that had covered the original accusations. In the statement, Gary admitted he'd been manipulated by a con artist into believing false evidence, apologized for making the accusations without verifying the information, and took full responsibility for the harm caused to my reputation and career. He explained Russell's scheme in detail, warned other families about similar scams targeting young athletes, and expressed his hope that I would eventually forgive him. The statement was covered extensively by sports media and helped rehabilitate my public image, though some skeptics still questioned whether Gary's explanation was truthful or just a convenient excuse. Russell Pemberton's criminal trial took place 6 months after his arrest, with Gary and me both testifying about how his scheme had targeted our family. The prosecution presented evidence of Russell's scams against at least 7 other families, showing a pattern of extortion and fraud that had netted him approximately $300,000 over 3 years. Russell's defense attorney tried to argue that he was merely an aggressive businessman rather than a criminal, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury convicted him on all counts after deliberating for just 4 hours, and Judge Sheffield sentenced him to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. The judge noted that Russell's crimes had caused significant harm to young athletes and their families, destroying opportunities and causing lasting emotional trauma. The civil lawsuit against Russell resulted in a $1.8 million judgment that Catherine acknowledged would be nearly impossible to collect, since Russell had spent most of his ill-gotten gains and had no significant assets. However, the judgment was important symbolically and would follow Russell for the rest of his life, garnishing any future earnings and ensuring he could never profit from his crimes. The settlement with Gary was more modest, requiring him to pay $75,000 over 5 years, and to perform 200 hours of community service speaking to youth sports organizations about the dangers of fraud and the importance of verifying information before making accusations. My college recruitment slowly recovered with the help of the criminal conviction and Gary's public apology. USC had remained interested throughout the process and ultimately offered me a full scholarship, which I accepted after visiting campus and meeting with the coaching staff. The head coach, Raymond Sullivan, who'd built the program into a national powerhouse over 12 years, told me directly that he believed in second chances, and that my character had been tested and proven through adversity. Several other players on the team had faced false accusations or unfair scrutiny, and the program prided itself on supporting athletes who'd been wronged by the system. I enrolled at USC the following fall and started as a freshman linebacker, continuing the trajectory that Gary's accusations had nearly derailed. The experience had changed me in ways I'm still processing years later, making me more cautious about trust and more aware of how quickly reputations can be destroyed by lies. I maintained occasional contact with Gary, who attended family gatherings and slowly rebuilt relationships with my parents and extended family. I never fully forgave him for what he did, but I understood how he'd been manipulated, and I didn't want to let Russell's scheme destroy our family permanently. The story had an unexpected epilogue when Detective Delgado contacted me 2 years later to inform me that Russell had been running a similar extortion operation from inside federal prison, using contraband cell phones to target new victims. Russell was caught and charged with additional crimes, adding years to his sentence and ensuring he would spend the majority of his remaining productive years behind bars. The detective thanked me for my testimony at the original trial and told me that without my cooperation, Russell might have received a lighter sentence and been back on the streets causing more harm. Looking back on the championship game and everything that followed, I recognized that the accusation was designed to destroy me, but instead revealed important truths about manipulation, trust, and resilience. Russell Pemberton tried to extort my family, and when that failed, tried to ruin my athletic career as punishment. Gary allowed himself to be manipulated because of his own insecurities and his complicated relationship with athletic success after his own career ended prematurely. I survived because the truth was provable through drug tests, and because we had resources to investigate and fight back legally. The hardest lesson was understanding that people close to you can cause immense harm, not from malice, but from weakness and poor judgment. Gary loved me and wanted me to succeed, but when faced with sophisticated manipulation and fabricated evidence, he made catastrophic decisions that nearly destroyed what he claimed to want to protect. His public accusation was an act of profound betrayal, but it came from a place of fear and confusion rather than hatred. That complexity makes forgiveness difficult, because I can't simply hate him or dismiss him from my life without losing important family connections. I graduated from USC with a degree in business administration and was drafted in the third round by an NFL team, achieving the dream that Gary's accusations had nearly stolen. My professional career has been solid if not spectacular, and I've used my platform to speak about fraud schemes targeting young athletes and their families. I partnered with the FBI and NCAA to create educational programs warning families about the tactics con artists use, helping prevent others from falling victim to scams like Russell's. Gary and I have an awkward but functional relationship now, maintaining contact primarily through family events and occasional phone calls. He never fully recovered from the guilt and shame of what he did, and I've watched him struggle with depression and regret for years. Part of me wants to tell him I've completely forgiven him, and that we're fine, but that would be a lie, and our relationship doesn't need more lies. What we have instead is an honest acknowledgement that he made terrible mistakes that caused real harm, that he's genuinely sorry, and that we're both trying to move forward despite the permanent scars. The championship game itself is remembered by most people for Gary's accusations rather than our victory, which stings, but feels inevitable. The video has millions of views on YouTube, and I still occasionally get recognized as that kid whose uncle said he used steroids. I've learned to tell the full story when asked, explaining how a con artist manipulated my uncle as part of an extortion scheme, and how the truth eventually came out through criminal investigation. Most people respond with sympathy once they understand the context, though some remain skeptical because lies spread faster and farther than corrections. The financial settlement from Russell's conviction and the civil judgment against Gary helped offset some of the endorsement opportunities I lost, though nothing can fully compensate for the emotional trauma of being publicly accused of cheating when you've worked legitimately for everything you achieved. The drug tests proved I was clean, the investigation proved I was targeted, and the criminal conviction proved there was a sophisticated conspiracy against me. Yet some people still believe I must have been guilty of something, because they can't accept that innocent people sometimes get destroyed by lies. If I could go back and change anything, I would have insisted on better communication with Gary in the months leading up to the championship game. Russell's manipulation worked because Gary isolated himself with his fears and doubts instead of talking to my parents or me directly. A single conversation where Gary showed me the photos and asked for an explanation might have prevented everything, because I could have immediately identified them as forgeries, and we could have gone to the police together. But that's the nature of manipulation. Russell specifically designed his scheme to prevent that communication, to make Gary feel like he was protecting secrets instead of seeking truth. The experience taught me that truth alone isn't sufficient protection against false accusations. You also need resources, legal representation, investigative support, and time for the truth to emerge through proper channels. I was fortunate that my parents could afford Catherine Grant's legal fees and Dorothy Chang's investigation, that doctor. Kingsley conducted thorough testing according to proper protocols, and that Detective Delgado pursued Russell's criminal activity aggressively. Many athletes facing false accusations don't have those advantages, and their careers get destroyed even when they're innocent because they can't afford to fight back effectively. I think about the 7 other families Russell victimized before we stopped him, wondering how many young athletes had their dreams stolen by his schemes. Some of them probably paid the extortion money and never reported it, living with the financial and emotional burden rather than risk public exposure. Others might have been publicly accused like me, but lacked the resources to investigate and fight back, their reputations permanently damaged by lies they couldn't disprove. Russell spent years perfecting his operation before we caught him, and the damage he caused extended far beyond the measurable financial losses. The championship trophy sits in a display case in my parents' house, representing both my greatest athletic achievement and one of my worst life experiences. When I look at it, I remember the final interception that sealed our victory, and I also remember Gary's voice screaming accusations through the stadium speakers. Both memories are permanently linked, and I've accepted that I'll never be able to separate the triumph from the trauma. That's what Russell Pemberton and his scheme stole from me, not my career or my future, but the pure joy of that championship moment. Gary told me once during a family dinner years later that he wishes he'd been stronger, that he wishes he'd questioned Russell's evidence instead of accepting it, that he wishes he'd protected me instead of attacking me. I told him I wished all those things too, but that wishes don't change what happened. We have to live with the reality that he destroyed my championship celebration and damaged my reputation, that I lost scholarship opportunities and endorsement deals, and that our relationship will never fully recover. He accepted that with tears in his eyes, and we finished dinner talking about other things, because sometimes that's all you can do. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.